I will start with Helen, who was asking at the beginning of your lecture, how are other forms of ethics than the charity ethics informing the history of rights that you've been conveying today? So other than charity, what's at stake here?
I think the recognition that disabled people do not want to be taken care of. We want the same access to choice making, to the right to make decisions, the same civil rights as any non-disabled person would have, and the ability to have autonomy, and the recognition that autonomy does not necessarily mean working independently, that we are interdependent, but we need access to services and supports that enable us to utilize our autonomy effectively, and recognize that disability rights are human rights, and disability should be on the same continuum as other marginalized population groups.
So Nancy, so beside the kind of general society's wish to be charitable, do you see other forces at work that would have gone some way towards granting rights with another logic than just charity?
Well, I think that we have been able, as disabled people, we've been able to draw parallels between what's happening with other marginalized population groups and how disability has been, and disabled people have been portrayed and discriminated against throughout. So looking, building on intersectionality, that's the important thing. Looking at how we can join together with the larger women's movement, for example, other racialized movements in the LGBTQ movement, because there are parallels here. We have to get beyond the sort of siloing, because people are just more than just one thing, right? I'm a disabled woman. Don't ask me to separate between the two. So I think that we've been able to draw on the rights approaches that other marginalized population groups have used.
Thank you. So the second question is from Sandy Barron, who does research on the history of deaf Canadians, and he's asking, how does the insistence on lumping disabled groups together has affected the story you're telling? His research shows that deaf Canadians were successful in the 1920s in getting the right to drive, to education, to insurance, to employment. But can we compare them, and can you talk about lumping them together or acting separately? He's also thanking you.
Okay. Deaf Canadians have been very successful in acquiring goods and services, at least at the very beginning. But there have been difficulties for deaf Canadians as well, specifically when educational authorities were stressing oralism, for example. There was difficulties in having ASL recognized as language. I think the deaf community is strong and defined, and there are real cultural elements that are strongly identified, and that group has enabled a rights-based approach to be more readily available, whereas and there weren't the same, there were barriers, but there were not the same barriers for deaf people to get together and strategize around rights acquisition, as opposed to people with physical disabilities who had difficulty accessing transportation, accessing a means to get together and strategize toward rights acquisition. And uh, there's been an oversimplification of disabled people being seen as you're either disabled or you're not. There's nothing sort of in between. It's an all or nothing binary, whereas I do not think that the deaf population has been subject to that quite as much. The barriers are there are barriers, but there are different barriers. And I think around physical disability and there has been a much greater tendency for oversimplification because we get, as a culture, we get hung up on physicality or the lack thereof.
So that's a really a really good transition to the next question, which is also about the variety of disabilities by Kristin Jenkin, who's thanking you for all your knowledge there and is asking about the issue of invisible conditions, including autism, chronic pain, and early onset dementia. These are often left out of the discussion, and even within autism and Dawn that you were mentioning, women, especially those without intellectual disability, are discounted and don't fit easily in the organization like Dawn.
That's a very good point that you raise. It's important to remember that the majority of disability, I come with hardware, I use crutches, and that's what the majority population, they need the markers to identify disability, but the reality is most disability is invisible. And you wouldn't know a person had a disability or a chronic illness unless they self-identified. And because unfortunately disability is not seen as culturally sexy, unfortunately, and I don't understand why, people choose not to self-identify because there could be a high social price to be paid. And people with invisible disabilities have difficulty in that because of the limited understanding of the larger culture. Often they're always put in a position of having to prove that they have a disability, whereas those of us with the markers commonly associated with disability are put in the opposite situation, that we have to prove utility. I hope that makes sense. And so there's a constant struggle at both ends of the continuum that you have to deal with. Does your disability, chronic impairment, really exist because you don't have those markers, or are you completely incapacitated because you have those markers? That's somewhat of an overstatement, but there are those elements exist.
Okay,
Does that help, or is it confusing?
So far, the author of the first two questions, thank you for the answers. So we'll see. Okay. Kristin does it. So the fourth question is from a student here, graduate student, who's asking about accessibility at universities such as Carleton, which you know well. Are they doing more than the bare minimum? And do you have examples of universities where things are doing in a way that you think they should focus on?
Okay, Carleton's my old alma mater, and physical access is one of the finest, plus the finest in Canada, plus they're a 24-hour attendant care provision, which is unique as far as I understand in Canada, which is really important. However, there's a broader issue that we have to look at, which is the presence of disability in the academy, and we have to look around at and when I say the academy, I mean universities, colleges, and education institutions in general. The academy has yet to develop a real comfort level around disability and disability issues, and it's an attitudinal comfort level that has to be dealt with on a broader scale, because of the elite nature of of how the university sees itself, how the academy sees itself, and the historical understanding of disability as being defective or weak or somehow less than, that somehow the presence of disability may be perceived as compromising the elite nature of the academy itself. And oftentimes it's the policies, services, and programs that both disabled students and faculty and staff have to deal with, working around. We have to work around situations where in the academy we are seen as exceptional or unexpected. On either side of the desk, there's still an individualized crisis response mechanism toward disability, and disability has yet to be seen as a regular part of the university landscape and an expected part of the university landscape. We have to, and my geography elements are coming in through there, but we have to learn to expect disability and recognize disability as being a natural part of the university experience, and an enriching part of the university experience too, because diversity in whatever form brings creativity and depth.
Thank you. So Christine, the question before, thank you, said that she was also an alumni of Carleton from way back then, and salute ageism there. So Ona is asking the fifth question. Could you talk about intergenerational activism? She's interested in the topic of how generations learn from each other in resistance tactics.
Well, it's disabled people these days are using social media, which is important, and the fact that we're using a virtual access at the moment breaks down barriers, and unfortunately, the generation coming up is going to have to continue what we're doing, what we've done through the past, because our rights aren't secure, as you can see, where disabled people find themselves in the midst of a pandemic. Our rights and inclusion status changes when the majority feels threatened. For example, in the UK, 2/3 of the people who have died as a result of COVID are people with disabilities, and those statistics are repeating themselves globally, even here. So, and we are often, disabled people are seen as placeholders and place takers, as opposed to being natural occupants of space. So it's important that next generations and the generations before mine, if you can believe it, have to work together. Like the aging population has to work with the population readily identified as disabled, and the broader society has to recognize that any shifts that are made for disabled people, positive shifts, positive rights shifts, will ultimately be beneficial to them. So we have to work together, because working individually, it's physically and emotionally taxing. So if we work together and recognize commonalities and intersectionality, it sort of makes it less difficult to move things forward, and look at history repeating itself and how improvements can be made. Does that help?
Thank you. It's certainly a great answer. So the next question relates to what you said earlier about the importance of counting, and how these early statistical surveys showed that disability was real. So Tracy is asking about data, and she has a research team that has discovered that there's no data set, no typology of long-term residents and assisted living residents in Canada. and other types of living arrangement. And she's asking you for insight as to how we may go about building such a data set. Is there an organization in Canada that has expertise in counting that way and in this area?
Well, I would say a good place to start would be Statistics Canada, but the fact that these individuals have not, in living in these situations, have not been counted is testimony to the lack of worthiness attributed to these population groups, or the lack of importance attributed to these population groups. Again, it's the and I recognize that Statistics Canada is not counting this group either, but it's a good place to start in how to start counting. We have to start asking the questions, and we have to start recognizing that this is an issue, and bringing it forward with the various agencies to underscore the importance of doing this, right? But we have to ask ourselves, why is it so important to quantify difference? Why are we focused on simply counting? We have to get, counting is a place to start, but we have to move beyond that, working towards substantive change, right? And sort of deconstruct and reconstruct the situations that disabled people and disadvantaged groups find themselves, and sort of shifting the perspective, right? And so we can start. Counting is a place to start. Statistics Canada is an agency that does that. They're by no means perfect, but it's a place to start. And I would also contact other disability-led organizations, other organizations that deal with long-term care home issues, because there are a lot of issues that need to be dealt with, and it's right now it's a very tragic situation.
So you're not aware of anyone counting anything on this at the moment?
No,
No.
But you have to start. You have to start. That's the thing. You have to recognize that people are worth counting in the first place, right?
Good.
Because
so maybe a history of how on earth they came to count at Statistics Canada early on would be interesting. So the next question is from Miranda, and she's asking if you could speak a little about your own experience as a disabled woman in academia.
Oh, it's an interesting experience. All right. I'm very lucky to be on the side of the desk that I am, because as yet disability is very underrepresented in the academy. And disability has always been present in the academy, but there's been a reluctance to come out as disabled, whereas me being a four-legged woman, a woman who uses crutches, I can't exactly walk into a room and say, who, me? I'm not disabled. It's interesting because my presence too is usually unexpected or extraordinary. It's not natural. And what often happens to marginalized population groups in the academy who are academics, they're often called upon to fix or help fix a system that is sort of broken, and they're in the midst of having to deal with, and they had nothing to do with it in the first place. And what we have to do is get beyond quantification and start looking at programs and services that have to be sort of deconstructed and reconstructed, or constructed in the first place, that facilitate a difference in the academy, and recognize a difference as a positive thing as opposed to something that's disruptive to the established order. So it's my experience has been, shall we say, variable, but I'm here. I'm very lucky. I love my job, and I'm always being presented with opportunities for education.
Thank you on this. So the conversation on statistics is continuing in the chat box with your colleague Roy Haynes saying that statistics are hard because disability often falls on the provincial and territorial legislature. And Tracy saying she'll carry on, she'll follow up with you to ask for advice for her research.
Okay.
We still have 3 questions to go in a few minutes, so I'll do my best to honor them. Anne is asking, thus far at Carleton, our own Paul Menton Center has not made accommodation on the accommodation to acknowledge COVID. Um, can you talk about how maybe COVID has led to this or not led to this, like at Carleton?
Can you please repeat the question? I'm not exactly sure if I
So at
understood.
Carleton, we have a whole set of accommodations for disability through our Paul Menton
The
Center.
Paul Menton, yes.
Their own criteria for accommodation has not budged since the beginning of COVID. And she's saying everybody needs to slow down. And is there any way by which you've seen that happening somewhere else, where the very disabilities accommodation for people with disability has been furthered or extended because of COVID?
Well, I've seen, that's not to say it hasn't happened in Canada, but I've noticed a lot happening in the UK amongst disabled academics and amongst American academics with the SDS, Society Disability in the States. I think, let's see, that there has been little understanding of the difficulties, and this is generally, I'm not underscoring any particular institution or singling out any particular institution, but generally educational facilities have been very mixed with regard to accommodations around COVID-19. I know there's been, I was listening to a talk on the radio the other day where a noted lawyer, David Lepofsky, who's advocating for the AODA, had been talking about how there had been a little accommodation for disabled students in the primary and secondary grades, that they were kind of left behind. And there's sort of this underlying thing that disabled people's educational capacity is perhaps limited anyway. So there's less of a urgency to deal with accommodation of disability than there are for, say, non-disabled students, right? It's that underlying perception that the capacity of disabled people is, questionable. And I know that won't be articulated, but disability accommodation is often treated as an add-on or afterthought. And in the midst of COVID, when the majority is busy trying to deal with the stuff that disabled people have dealt with for a very long time, again, disability accommodation is sort of put to the sidelines. And there are problems with understanding that platforms, for example, may not be accessible to people, that electronic platforms may not be accessible to people using screen readers, for example. And so, I mean, there's a whole lot of things that have to be dealt with all at the same time. And again, it underscores the tenuous nature of accommodations for disabled people in the first place.
Okay, so you've answered a record number of 8 questions in 20 minutes. We have 4 more. I'll tell you what they are about. I suspect there's one you would prefer to answer. I'll just let you choose because they're all very good. One of them is about intersectionality and advice on the dream team to study this by Rebecca. Number 2 is about Danielle, about health education and disability, right? And how to do this
Mhm.
well. The third one is from Sarah about rights that might conflict with disability rights, right? That might go against other kinds of rights. And the last one is from your colleague Roy about the rise of ILM in Canada and its connection with the American ILM. So you have now 2 minutes to pick one and
Okay,
answer.
okay. Um, can you clarify what ILM is, please, for me?
About, so then I'll wait for Roy to answer that. So maybe in the meantime we can go to another one.
Okay, so, okay, can I talk about, because my postdoc dealt with disabled women's access to primary care.
Yeah,
Okay,
well, there you go. We'll finish on that now.
okay. So what's interesting for me is we have traditionally, historically, we've had a very medicalized approach to disability and disability issues. That disability is often framed as a medical issue, as a deficit issue, as a defect issue, as a lack of functionality, okay? As opposed to a human rights and social justice issue. However, the medical profession itself has had very little exposure to the lived experience of disability beyond the fix, repair, or eliminate approach, right? And I would love to see that disabled people's issues are more receive a more coverage in medical school and social work schools, because since physicians and social workers play a very important role in the lives of disabled people, yet there's very little understanding of the lived experience of disability, right? And there's this sort of all or nothing approach to disability. So I would like to see disability and social justice issues being incorporated into medical syllabi, for example, and social work syllabi on a regular basis, and not necessarily to be disability specific, but just to recognize that disability should be included in the continuum, because if because people with disabilities still have to jump through medical and social work hoops to access basic goods and services, for everything from tax credits to access to transportation to, in some jurisdictions, whether or not you can have your house cleaned. So I think it's important that that disability have a greater spectrum of understanding beyond fix, repair, or eliminate.
Okay, so that was a record of 10 questions in 25 minutes, Nancy. Before I thank you, I would like to invite everyone to the next lecture, which is from Teresa Scassa, who is a Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa, who will speak about the history of privacy and the future of AI. But now it's up to me to, in the name of everyone, and a lot of people in the chat boxes have been thanking you profusely for a wonderful lecture and for all the answers to these very profound and generous questions that everybody's been asking. So thank you so very much, Nancy.
Thank you. It's been truly my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.